How many of you have ever heard of Red Dwarf? Ah, all right. For those who might be unfamiliar with the show, it's a British science fiction spoof. Dave Lister is the last survivor of humanity, a space bum with questionable personal hygiene, and he only survives by accident. He was in the brig when a radiation leak killed everyone else on the spaceship where he worked. Lister's crime? He smuggled a pregnant cat on board. Stop that, Marcy. When the ship's computer determines that the radiation levels are safe again, it releases Lister from stasis. Only it's 3 million years later. Beside the said computer, Lister's only companions are a holographic version of his old roommate, Arnold Judas Rimmer, whom Lister could never stand, a creature that evolved from Lister's pet cat, and an android named Crichton, whom they picked up along the way. At the heart of the show lies the classic British double act. Rimmer, the hologram, is the somewhat socially awkward one, uptight, who insists on following the rules to the letter or his own benefit, but he secretly envies the other one. Lister, the space bum, is the more popular, relaxed, laid-back, and amiable of the two, who teases his colleague unmercifully and gives the audience a good laugh. I'm thinking of a particular episode which begins with the 4 crewmates watching an old film with a very Casablanca-esque feel. You two might remember it. Lister is in tears, but Rimmer just sits there sneering at it. And when the movie ends, he describes it as a pile of blubbery schoolgirl mush. When Rimmer adds that he found it unrealistic and total baloney, Lister responds, "Rimmer, you said that about King of Kings, the story of Jesus." Rimmer's reply is, "Well, it's true. A simple carpenter's son who learns how to do magic tricks like that and doesn't go into show business? Do any of us believe that even for a second?" Lister observes, "He was supposed to be the Son of God." Not to be deterred, Rimmer continues, "And when he was carrying that cross up the hill, any normal, realistic bloke would have mule-kicked the guy on the left, clobbered the one on the right, and been over that green hill and far away before you could say Pontius Pilate." To which Lister says, "Why do I feel that somehow you've missed the point? I mean, whether you believe that stuff or not, it's about a dude who sacrifices his life for love." "Not realistic," Rimmer scoffs, as if. "You've got no soul, man," says Lister sadly, "no soul." Lister's point about a dude that sacrifices his life for love makes me remember a conversation I had with one of my younger cousins during my senior year in high school. This is the same cousin, by the way, 5 years younger than I am, who once asked me to help her learn her memory verse. I got her to the point of being able to repeat the verse. I think it was from either 1st or 2nd Corinthians. But then I committed one of the deadly sins. I asked her, "Okay, so what does that mean?" And she couldn't tell me. So then I said, "I always thought that learning Bible verses doesn't do you any good if you don't understand them. What's the point if you don't know what it means?" For some reason, she couldn't tell me that either. Anyway, this cousin plus my siblings and I were at her grandmother's house after school this particular day. My cousin starts telling me about this boring video she'd had to watch in class. As she described it to me, I realized that she was talking about a version of Cyrano de Bergerac, and that I'd just watched the same video in French class. It was filmed in 1974 and starred Marsha Mason, later from The Goodbye Girl, as Roxanne, and it featured Catherine Crosby, who was Bing's widow by then, in a minor role. I'd already seen at least one animated version of the Cyrano story a few years earlier, and there was also this Brady Bunch episode which adapted the famous balcony scene in which Cyrano, pretending to be his shy best friend, woos the fair Roxanne on his friend's behalf. So it didn't occur to me at the time to question why they'd be showing a film version of Edmond Rostand's most famous drama to kids who couldn't have been older than 7th graders. And I do have to admit that the first half of Rostand's Cyrano, which focuses more on our hero's career as the finest swordsman in all France than on the romance bit, probably is a little slow for a lot of students that age. Once I heard and recognized my cousin's story, though, I told her that I was surprised she hadn't enjoyed the video and that I would have thought it was right up her alley. When she asked why, I told her the main outlines of the story, which many of us already know. Cyrano loved Roxanne so much that he sacrificed his happiness to hers and helped his best friend Christian win her because Roxanne wanted Christian. And for his part, Christian was in love with Roxanne, but he was shy with women. It was only on the day Cyrano died, years after Christian's death in battle, that Roxanne finally learned the truth. It was Cyrano whose words had won her, Cyrano who had written the love letters she'd always thought were from Christian, Cyrano who'd loved her all those years before and after Christian's death. For some reason, my cousin Shani was a lot more interested in Cyrano after she heard the rest of the story. I like to think that Cyrano's sacrifice moved her, as it has moved so many others since the late 19th century. Sacrifice isn't easy, especially if it isn't voluntary, whether wholly or in part. And sometimes we just aren't given a choice about the directions our lives will take. There are plenty of examples of this in the Bible and in secular history. For instance, after leading the Exodus, Moses wasn't allowed to lead the people of Israel into Canaan, even though he had seen the Israelites through 40 challenging years in the desert. And what does Moses do? In obedience to God's commandment, Moses acknowledges Joshua as his successor in a public ceremony. Try saying that 3 times fast. By the laying on of hands, which symbolized the passage of spirit from Moses to Joshua, and by transferring some of his authority to Joshua, which is Numbers 27:18-23. Much later on in the biblical narrative, in the 7th chapter of 2 Samuel, we read about what happened when one of King David's desires was denied. Now, when the king dwelt in his house and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies round about, the king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent." And Nathan said to the king, "Go, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." But that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? I've not dwelt in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. In all the places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now therefore thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel, and I've been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your seed after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. In accordance with all these words, and in accordance with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David. The outlines of the story are fairly clear. King David wants to be the one to build God a temple, and the prophet Nathan initially gives permission on God's behalf. But then that night, Nathan has a dream in which God appears to him and withdraws the permission. As I said earlier, sacrifice isn't easy, and neither is being denied one of your desires or intentions. So what does King David do? In 2 Samuel, he goes to the tent in which the Ark of the Covenant has been placed, and he prays a prayer of gratitude for all of God's gifts to him. Tellingly, in 1 Chronicles 29, David begins or continues to gather construction materials for the temple which he won't be allowed to build. Now, David could certainly resist Nathan's message and try to build God a temple anyway, but he doesn't. Instead, he does what he can to prepare the way for the one who will be able to do what he can't. Samuel is a much earlier source than Chronicles, and I know that any historian worthy of being taken seriously will tell you that records which are closer in time to the events they claim to describe are more likely to be correct than later records. But I also know that this picture of David preparing the way for his son and successor has the ring of truth about it. It's what parents so often do. Coming into more modern times, what do you think about the following situation? An elderly national leader with a speech impediment, which causes him to hesitate and search for words occasionally, and which he has put a great deal of time and effort into overcoming, is denied the chance to serve another term in office. This is despite the fact that he has led his country through a great time of crisis, and that his work isn't quite finished yet. I'm talking about Winston Churchill, of course. Why? Who did you think I meant? Churchill led the British to victory as Prime Minister during most of World War II. VE Day, the surrender of Nazi Germany, happened on Churchill's watch. Yet in the general election of July 1945, just weeks before the Japanese surrender ended World War II in the Pacific, the British public voted Churchill out of office. Do you think that was easy for him? When the election results came in, Churchill's wife Clementine, who was a lifetime supporter of the Liberal Party, told her husband that, quote, the election loss, might be a blessing in disguise, to which he replied, at the moment, it seems quite effectively disguised. Mm-hmm. And as late as mid-September of that year, 1945, Churchill wrote a letter to another conservative MP in which he blamed his election defeat on the rise of bad elements, including conscientious objectors. Now contrast the previous example with the following story about a conversation Pennsylvania-born artist Benjamin West had with Britain's King George III on whether George Washington really would give up power voluntarily. We're pretty sure that the conversation took place because West was so impressed by the king's response that he described the incident to at least 2 people who recorded the story in their diaries, which have survived. What isn't entirely clear is when it happened. It was either before Washington's resignation from the Army at the end of 1783, just after the close of the Revolution, or when he announced his intention to retire to Mount Vernon after serving 2 terms as president. Anyway, what King George said was that if Washington, his erstwhile opponent in the American Revolution, actually did voluntarily relinquish power, he would be the greatest man in the world. And as history tells us, Washington surrendered power not once, but twice. We all know the truth of what Shakespeare said so long ago, that flesh is heir to heartache and 1,000 natural shocks, while we suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. That's Hamlet for those of you who are trying to remember which play it's from. We also recognize the truth found in the letter of James about violence arising from our thwarted and frustrated desires. George Fox used that last one while articulating one of the earliest versions of the Quaker Peace Testimony. The point is that life will throw a lot of us, much of it unpleasant, and how we respond is up to us. We can rail against the hand that has been dealt us and blame the rise of bad elements. We can scoff at the very notion of sacrifice itself. Not realistic, as if. Or we can make a virtue of necessity and embrace sacrifice. We can put aside our own happiness so that the one we love can be happy. We can prepare the way for others. We can pass the torch to the next generation. In short, we can allow ourselves to be guided by these immortal words so often ascribed to the Apostle Paul. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends.